seeing right now that we're seeing right now that corporations are investing big money into diversity, equity, and inclusion, and and into doing their anti-racism work, creating whole new departments and new leadership positions, all aimed around that, which tells me that they've seen the polling, and they know that that's a solid investment of their resources. How it shows up, I think, is what remains to be seen. So this is just a little segment of our manifestations of racism. We know that racism can show up as either malicious, strategic, coded, routine and cultural, or systemic and institutional. And I'm going to go over some various examples, but first I want to give a content warning. Our resolution from 2019 asked that we add a content warning whenever we're showing photos, or folks are being subjected to, things that may trigger some generational trauma. So I just want to lift up that I'm going to show you some images that may be difficult to see and share some language that may be difficult to read. So the first type of racism is that malicious racism, right? This is ugly, violent, socially destructive. It's burning crosses and white hoods. It's hurtful words and angry comments. It is easy to identify and therefore easy to condemn. The challenge with malicious racism is that insisting that racism can only take this one form is a political strategy, because it allows folks to claim that racism is largely in the past, that whatever they're saying and doing can't possibly be racist, because they don't regularly use racial or derogatory words, right? And if racism doesn't fit this very specific example, then what you're seeing or witnessing or experiencing can't be racist. And in fact, we know that racism can show up in a number of other ways. Strategic racism. Strategic racism is the decision to manipulate the racial fears and hatreds of others for selfish ends. The strategy in strategic racism is to divide and conquer, right? This has been at the core of American politics for at least the last half century. Probably no one has used it more effectively than our former commander-in-chief. And we typically think of racism in terms of intentional harm to people of color, and that's certainly a huge element. But we lose sight of racism's full power when we only focus on how it injures people of color. Dog whistling uses racism to structure the basic rules of government and the marketplace. So if you think about this quote here, which is a quote from our former president, and he says, would somebody else mind reading this? Because I can't see, I'm trying to see your faces, so I can only see half of my PowerPoint presentation.
I'll read it.
Thank you.
Strategic racism. Quote, we have people coming into the country or trying to come in. We're stopping a lot of them. You wouldn't believe how bad these people are. These aren't people, these are animals. And we're taking them out of the country at a level and at a rate that's never happened before, end quote.
So this is an example of strategic racism, because over the last, several years, immigration has been racialized. So now when we think about immigrants, we're thinking about Black and brown people. And when our former commander-in-chief refers to immigrants as not even people, he refers to them as animals, then we end up with policies that put kids in cages, right? That is the strategic use of racism to change and influence policy at the national level that harms all of us. Because if you dig a little bit deeper and you look at how much has been invested in immigration enforcement since 2012, and how much has been invested in labor standards enforcement, you can see the impacts to the entire labor movement because of the racialization of immigration policy. And if you think about over the last 30 or 40 years, how policies rather have been passed that really harm our communities, that have been rooted in racism. Think about welfare reform and the welfare mom in the Cadillac and the images that come to mind, and how, welfare policy was racialized, how racism was used strategically to move welfare reform. Think about how racism was used strategically to move criminal justice reform and laws like minimum sentencing guidelines and 3 strikes you're out policies, and how that harms all of our communities, not just our Black and brown communities. So those are some examples of the strategic use of racism. But racism is also coded, right? It can show up through language. Coded racism works by invoking racial stereotypes without actually calling out race, right? A coded racism comes in when politicians deploy stereotypes without expressly saying that they're talking about Black and brown people. So think about the images that come to mind when you hear thugs versus the images that come to mind when you hear frat boys, or the images that come to mind when you think about suburban moms versus welfare queens. The images that come to mind when we talk about urban versus rural, right? The middle class, hardworking Americans, immigrants, aliens. There are all these different ways that we talk about race in a coded way without actually talking about race. So here's another example of coded racism, and I wonder if somebody wouldn't mind reading this part.
How about you, Joe Ference? Take yourself off mute.
There you go. I figured it out.
What part do you want Joe to read?
You can just read the first part.
So Joe, right under where it says Donald J. Trump, where it says I'm happy, you read that, please.
What do you want me to do?
So read where it says Donald J. Trump, I'm happy to inform. Just read that piece.
I'm happy to inform all of the people living their suburban lifestyle dream that you will no longer be bothered or financially hurt by having low-income housing built in your neighborhood. Your housing prices will go up based on the market and crime will go down. I've rescinded the Obama-Biden AFFH rule. Enjoy.
Thank you, Joe.
Thank you, Joe. Yes, this is a prime example of coded racism, because when Donald Trump is talking to folks living their suburban lifestyle dream, there are certain images that invokes, right? And when he talks about folks, how crime will go down, there are certain images that invokes as well. This is the coded use of racism, also used strategically around housing policy, right? This is housing policy that would allow more multi-unit family homes, or investments into more multi-unit family homes. As you know, housing is growing more and more scarce and unattainable in many of our populated areas, right? But this is just one of the examples of coded racism. He doubles down to say the suburban housewife, and now he's putting this in quotes. So he wants you to know exactly who he's talking about. So there's some dog whistling in here too. They want safety, and they're thrilled that I ended the long-running program where low-income housing will invade their neighborhood. Words like invasion that he used very strategically around immigration policy as well. So I don't want to spend all of our time tonight pummeling you with tweets from our former commander-in-chief, but he did give us a lot of material to work with. The other way that racism manifests, though, is routine and cultural, right? Routine racism, for most of us, racism is routine. And I don't mean to sound cavalier or like racism is no big deal, but the point is that racism is common sense, and that informs part of our everyday understanding of the world, even for people who mean well, and even for people of color. This shows up in inappropriate jokes and remarks. This is what leads to implicit bias. It impacts the way we interact with each other. And for labor leaders, it really means who we may be and may not be engaging in the workplace, right? Folks that we are naturally drawn to and folks that we just naturally are not drawn to. All of that is routine and it's built into our culture. And here's a really good example of routine and cultural racism. Many of you have probably seen this. This is after Hurricane Katrina in August of 2005. Both of these images and these stories showed up on the exact same website, Yahoo News, on the same day. And you see the difference between these two images is that the two residents on the left of your screen wade through chest deep water after finding bread and soda from a local grocery store after Hurricane Katrina. The image on the right is a young man walks through chest deep floodwater after looting a grocery store in New Orleans. There's some stark differences here. If you want to take yourself off mute and tell me what you see or what you hear when I describe those. I think we got a minute or two for that. Is that okay?
Yeah, absolutely. So folks, what are you seeing here? I will calling you. I already called on Joe Farron, so
That means Joe's off the hook.
that's right. Joe's ahead of our Teamsters at Budweiser.
All right.
Make Budweiser beer and many other things there.
Good man to know.
I won't
Yes,
forget
he
that,
is.
Mark.
All right, I'll be calling on someone. Shelly. Please take yourself off mute, Shelly.
So can you hear me okay?
Yep, we hear you great.
So, well, I notice that they're making the assessment that the two folks on the left found the bread and soda, and the man on the right looted. I don't know how they could have done an interview with either of these groups, from judging where the photo was taken from. So I think just making that assessment and that assumption of what is happening there, and perhaps that's based on race.
Yeah. I mean, there's the difference between finding and looting, but then there are also, in addition, some other subtle things. The folks on the right or the folks on the left are identified as residents, therefore they belong to residents. The person on the right is not identified as belonging. The folks on the left are, they found bread and soda, so it's staples, right? Bread, soda, they're trying to survive. The person on the right is not identified as, we know that he looted a grocery store, but it's not like they say he looted, because you don't loot for bread, right? But he was looting a grocery store without identifying exactly what it was. And I don't know about the nature of the photos, but there's a lot that happens around lighting, and that leads to dehumanizing folks when the media portrays people of color, to darken their features or blur them out. There's also the assumption that this person on the right is a young man and not a young boy. There's a lot that, and every time I look at this image, I swear I think I find something different, but there's a lot that you can unpack here. I think the takeaway here is the routine and the cultural nature of racism and how it shows up. There's also, you might remember last year, after Jacob Blake was shot in the back by police, and then the subsequent days, Kyle Rittenhouse shot some protesters, but this exact same day, you can see they're just 2 hours apart from each other. How they describe Jacob Blake, that he had a knife in his car. This is a picture of him. He appears to be at a marijuana or cannabis dispensary, versus the suspected gunman, Kyle Rittenhouse, how they depict him as being a good Samaritan, and it's pictures of him cleaning graffiti off the wall. This is all part of what is routine and cultural and fed to us from the media. But racism is at its core systemic and institutional. Systemic and institutional racism is the network of institutional structures, policies, and practices that create advantages and disadvantages for white folks and lead to discrimination and oppression and disadvantages for marginalized or racialized groups of people. So if you think about how that shows up just in terms of the maternal mortality rate in Black women in this country across all socioeconomic conditions, the mortality rate is just higher. So there's systemic and institutional racism in our healthcare, systemic and institutional racism in our criminal justice system in terms of harsher punishments and charges for cocaine and drug possession. You see it reflected, this is from Seattle, but this is probably comparable to any other major city in median income in the city of Seattle and how wealth is distributed across this country. Just another example of the long-term impacts of systemic and institutional racism. We see it reflected in the wage gap, specifically as we're talking about, women of color, and how the wage gap grows based on what racialized group you're a member of. If we had a little more time tonight, I'd show you a video, but I'm happy to send along some additional resources on the long-term impacts of redlining, and some other, resources if you all are interested. But typically, we like to create a little bit of time in our workshops for folks to think about a time that they might have witnessed or experienced racism in their union or their workplace.
Actually, April, in the chat, Helen says she would like to have more visuals on how they're used. It speaks volumes. So
Okay.
And I would say that too, because we're obviously going to be using this recording going forward. That could be used in especially for our local unions, like someone like Joe could use this, at his local. That's probably be a really good local to do some of this work in, but some of the other locals in the area. So, but I'll hand it over back to you.
Yeah, so I don't, and I'm happy to share any resources. I can share links to the resolutions that we've passed and, other resources that are available on our website. We commissioned Bill Fletcher to write a narrative on why it's important for the labor movement to address systemic and institutional racism. I'm happy to provide you with the link to that document. You can download it for free. Again, all of our resources are free and open source, so you can take what works for you and leave whatever doesn't fit. So, if we were in a typical workshop, we'd break into small groups, we'd carve out a little bit of time for folks to share kind of how some of this landed, how it's sitting on you, what you heard that might have been new or different, what you heard or learned that might challenge your current understanding, and create some time to talk about our experiences. So I don't know that we have the luxury of that much time tonight, but I would like to open it up if anyone wants to share either an experience or just a reflection.